Hello everyone and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host for tonight's journey. Tonight I have a little something different for you. Normally I post 2.5 vlogs. I'm a low stakes specialist and one of the best in my field. There are many young vloggers out there documenting their journey to be the best poker player in the world. I am not one of those vloggers. I have no such ambitions. I'm an old man. Sometimes I wake up and my back hurts, or I'll have a kink in my neck that'll last for days. Sometimes I get random aches and pains for no reason at all that'll last for over a month. I have 2 kids and a whole lot of pets to feed. Sometimes I get asked, if I'm so good at 2.5, why don't I try higher stakes? Well, you need to understand that just because I'm good at one stake doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be good at the next. The strategy for the 1-3 game is completely different than the strategy for the 2.5 game, which is again completely different for the 2.5 deep stack game. And being good at all of those stakes means a whole lot of diddly you have to climb up to the 5-10 stakes. I'm perfectly comfortable where I'm at right now. I make a decent amount of money. I barely put in hardly any hours, work whenever I feel like it, and spend most of my time with my family. But putting all of that aside, let's go play some freaking 5-10. It's Friday night, October the 4th. I'm playing 5-10 no limit hold'em with the $10 big blind ante at the Win Encore in Las Vegas, where I buy in for $2,000, which is 200 big blinds. I don't play my first notable hand until 40 minutes into the session. We're on a 4-handed feeder table. I open to 40 on the button with Jack-Queen offsuit against the blinds. The small blind calls, but the big blind folds. The flop comes Ace, Jack, Queen with 2 diamonds and 1 club. The small blind comes out betting full pot for $100 with a $1,200 stack on a board that should be weighted way more heavily towards my range. We just flop bottom 2 pairs, but the board is super draw heavy. Bottom 2 pairs is also not a hand that has me super comfortable. I can very easily be counterfeited. My opponent can also have a hand like a 10 or a king high flush draw that is drawing almost to 45% against me. So I decide to raise the action up to 300. My opponent quickly makes the call. The turn comes out clean. It's a 5 of clubs. But now there's also 2 clubs on board to go along with the 2 diamonds. My opponent checks again. Not many people buy in short at these stakes, so I definitely think my opponent is a recreational player. If he has a flush draw or a weak ace, since we're so short-handed, he may be willing to play for stacks. He might also have a weak suited ace with clubs, which now has massive outs against me. So I don't slow down and throw out another huge bet of 600. Unfortunately, my opponent doesn't think very long before deciding to let his hand go. Still, I'm happy to be up $215 this early into the session. Only a couple minutes later, Under the Gun opens to 30 with a stack of about 2,000. I 3-bet to 100 on the button with ace-queen offsuit. I mean, we're still only 4-handed, so this is a pretty big monster, especially in position. The blinds fold, but my opponent calls. The flop comes Jack, King, 2, Rainbow. We flop a gut shot with an overcard. However, this flop is heavily leaned towards our 3-bet range, regardless of the fact that we don't actually have a pair. So when my opponent checks it over to me, I put in a pretty standard down bet of third pot for $80. My opponent calls again. The turn is a 4 of clubs, keeping the board rainbow and not changing anything. So when my opponent checks it to me for a second time, I ramp the action up to nearly 60% pot bet of 220. My opponent very quickly makes the call again. Alright, this is not a very comfortable position to be in. I still only have ace high. Can I spike an ace from space or a miracle 10 for a gut shot to the nuts? The river comes, and it's a 7 of spades. We don't improve. My opponent checks again for a third time. I could give up here and forfeit the $400 I've already invested. Show of hands, who thinks I should give up here?
Put your hand down, little Steve.
My opponent has been calling pretty quickly, so he likely has a king of some sort, maybe a hand like king 10. I definitely think he has top pair, but on the flip side, he's only been check calling. He hasn't shown any true strength, and I have admittedly been ramping up the sizing of my bets. So here I decide to go for the gold and smash for a full pot-sized bet of 800, tossing out 8 black chips, only to get snap called. I dejectedly show my hand, only to get shown 3-4 offsuit. My opponent literally flopped complete airball with 4 high, turned bottom pair, and snap called the river for a full pot-sized bet. What the actual farfanugan? Is this how Garrett Adelstein felt against Robbie Lou? I don't get what just happened here. How can you call with 3-4 offsuit out of position to a 3-bet pre-flop? How can you call in the flop with nothing but a Hail Mary backdoor straight draw? How can you snap call the river with such conviction with only bottom pair? Like, he didn't even think about it. His money went in almost as soon as mine did. I really don't get it. Is this guy really a demon? Did I just get my soul owned by a Balrog? This doesn't even happen in 1-3 games I've played. I'm like completely speechless. With this loss, I'm down $1,055 only 45 minutes into the session. I top up for another $700 and try to shake off the loss. A few hands later, the same opponent opens to 30 on the button. I look down at Ace King of Diamonds. I'm steaming from our last encounter. I 3-bet to 120. The big blind and under the gun fold, but of course our nemesis calls. The flop comes 5, 2, Jack, rainbow with 1 diamond. Once again, I flop a whole lot of diddly squat. I did warn you guys that hands like Ace King and Ace Queen are likely to miss 2 out of 3 flops. Heads up though, I'm likely to c-bet almost my entire range here. So I start with a slight down bet to 110, which is about 40% of the pot. My opponent quickly makes the call. If he's willing to call a flop with 4 freaking high, he's willing to call the flop with anything. So that doesn't necessarily mean he has a pair yet. He could have a hand like 10 queen, hoping to go runner again. So when the turn comes a 6 of spades, putting 2 spades on board, I don't let up. I lead for another 60% pot bet of 300. Thankfully, I get a fold from my opponent this time, which can only mean I was ahead with ace high. I don't think I bluffed my opponent here. I don't think my opponent is bluffable, which means I need to heavily change how I play against this particular opponent from now on. Here, I think I literally just had the best hand with my ace high. 20 minutes later, I get moved to the next feeder table in the lineup, but thankfully the table is more full, which plays more to my personal playstyle even if some of the players are currently sitting out. Here, under the gun limps. I decide to limp in the +1 with 7-8 offsuit. I don't recommend doing this in a 1-3 or even a 2-5 game, but ranges can be much wider in higher stakes. The small blind folds, and the big blind checks, so we go 3 ways to flop of ace, 9, 10, rainbow. I'm a huge fan of this flop. I love flopping open-ended on rainbow boards. These types of hands are many of the ones where I win the biggest pots with the least investment. So when the big blind checks, and under the gun leads for 30, I make the no-brainer call, and the big blind tags along as well. The turn is the 7 of hearts, putting 2 hearts on board and giving us bottom pair. I'm indifferent about this card. Sure, it increases our odds against a single pair holding, but if the straight comes, it will be incredibly obvious. I'm also not a huge fan of the backdoor potential draw either, reducing our odds in case one of our opponents is holding hearts. I'm also drawing dead to 8 Jack. So when the big blind checks again, and under the gun leads with a massive pot-sized bet for 120, I have to think about this for a moment. I eventually decide to call since I have position. I think if I were out of position here, I would just fold. Big blind gets out of the way though, so we go heads up to a river, and it's a beautiful 7 of spades. This is definitely my favorite river to hit. I wouldn't be overly excited about making 2 pairs or even a straight, but this 7, this is a super sneaky, sexy 7. This 7 is my friend. Don't tell my wife, but this 7 and I just had a little bit of backdoor fun. My opponent suddenly comes out with a slight overbet of 400. This is just an easy call. There's no reason to ever raise here. Against a bet so large, you're only going to get action from a better hand like 8 Jack or even a full house. So I make the call, and my opponent announces 8 high. If I had to guess, he probably had a hand like 8-6, potentially with spades, clubs, or even hearts. I don't make him show though, since I'm certainly beating 8 high, so I just table my hand for the much needed moral victory. With this win, we're now down only $449, 1 hour and 15 minutes into the session. Maybe things are finally starting to look up. 2 hands later, the low jack opens to 30 with roughly a $1,300 stack. The cutoff, who's a Chinese pro at the win named Brandon, 3 bets to 130. The button code calls with a stack of about 1100. He's the rec we played in the very first hand featured where I had Jack Queen offsuit. I've noticed he calls extremely light. There's quite a bit of trapped money already. I'm sitting here with Ace King offsuit in the big blind, which is a pretty darn big hand for these stakes. Players in higher stakes are massively more aggressive than in lower stakes. This is just a no-brainer 4-bet, which I make for $440. Suddenly, the original raiser 5-bet shoves for his entire stack. Brandon quickly gets out of the way. The button shakes his head and also sticks in a slightly smaller stack. It's only about 900 to me, so of course my only option here is to call. I talk the other 2 into running the action twice. I only need to win one of these boards to take down a nice profit. We talk about our hands and the button admits he only has a small pair. The low jack says he only has a middling pair, so I'm feeling pretty good about my odds here. If I just clear one of these boards, I'll be back in the green. The first board runs out, and it comes 2, 3, jack with 2 diamonds, with a jack of clubs on the turn and a 10 of clubs on the river. No help there. I'm a sad bear. The second board comes out, and it's 7, 10, 2, rainbow. There's another 7 on the turn, and the 5 of clubs on the river seals my fate. The button opens his hand to reveal pocket 8s, and the low jack opens his hand to reveal pocket 9s to take down the entire massive pot of almost 4K. Holy mother freaking architect! I can't hit a single pair with these so-called premium hands for the life of me. I'm now down $1,800, only a couple of hands after taking my first decent win. This is freaking disastrous. I add on for another $1,500, bringing my stack back up to $2,700. We don't get anything for the next 40 minutes. We've lost some players, so we're back down to 5-handed on this table. Finally, at long awaited last, I stare down at a premium made hand. No more of that ace-king, ace-queen bullcrap. We're talking about pocket freaking rockets. Alright, time to get down to business. I open to 30 in the cutoff, and everyone just folds. Wah, wah, wah. Oh, I see how it is. This is how my whole night is going to go, isn't it? For this next hand, I've been moved to the main table. +1 opens to 50. I 3-bet in the hijack to 150 with a pair of not-so-jiggities. The button cold calls, and the +1 tags along as well. So we go 3 ways to a flop of ace, 8, 10 with 2 clubs. Wouldn't you know it? Of course there had to be an ace. The action gets checked around. The turn comes, and it's a 7 of clubs. I check my hand, and I do have the jack of clubs, whatever that's worth. +1 suddenly leads for a staggering 320. This is not a feeler bet. This bet resounds with strength. I have a gut shot straight draw, and I do have a jack high flush draw, but unfortunately, if either hits, only one of my cards will play, so it's not exactly going to be very sneaky. This is if I'm even drawing live. One of my opponents could already have the flush here. Plus, I still have a player behind me that's yet to act, so I decide to just make the prudent fold. For educational and entertainment purposes, the button makes the call. The river brings a deuce of hearts. When the +1 makes another stagnant bet of 320, the button calls again. The +1 shows a set of 8s, and it's good. Thankfully, I lost the minimum here. The very next hand, I open to 40 in the low jack with ace-king offsuit. Because, this hand has been amazing for me tonight. The cutoff 3 bets to 140. The button suddenly cold 4 bets to 400 with about a 3K stack. The action folds around to me. There's already $600 of trapped money. If this were a 2-5 table, I would just fold here. I'm not invested in anything, and I'm completely out of position. But in a 5-10 game, people raise and re-raise with all sorts of garbaggio. And I mean, let's be real, I haven't been able to hit a hand all night. So when I look down at a hand like ace-king, they may as well be aces. Thinking back, I should have 5-bet here to about 1200. I'm currently sitting at a 2K stack. That would have been much more frightening. But in the moment, I'm just looking at the dead money, and I decide to just 5-bet rip it for my entire stack. The cutoff quickly gets out of the way. The button sighs and looks very uncomfortable. He asks for a chip count. That's always a good sign. I evade the snap call. I don't mind a fold here. $600 is a pretty good amount to add to my stack, and my morale is incredibly low right now. 45 seconds go by. What kind of hand tanks here that is willing to 4-bet to 400? Is my opponent really that tight and tanking with a hand like queens? Eventually, after a full minute, my opponent makes the call. We decide to run the action twice. The first board comes out, and it's king, 3, 10 with 3 hearts. That's a pretty darn good flop. As long as another heart doesn't peel, I should at least win this one. The turn brings a 6 of spades, but you already know what's coming. The river comes, and it's a jack of hearts. I lose to ace-queen, 10s, jacks. I'm only beating queens with no heart. The second board comes out, and it's 2, 3, 3 with 2 spades. So dread and despair start settling in, when the turn brings in a beautiful ace of diamonds, followed by a 5 of diamonds on the river. Alright! So if our opponent had a hand like queens with no heart, we scoop. But we should at least chop with just about every other hand, right? I table my hand, happy to have hit top pair, top kicker on both boards, only to have our opponent show ace freaking king with the ace of hearts. He takes half my money. The one time where I finally flop top pair, top kicker on both boards, and I still lose half my money. All I needed was a single pair in the last double board run out when we were all in 3 ways, but I couldn't even get that. Here to flop top pair, top kicker on both boards and still lose half my money? Wow, I'm pretty disheartened right now. We're at only 2 hours and 30 minutes into the session, and I'm already down $3,500. I add on for my last remaining $500 that I brought, and I'm sitting here with a short stack of only $1,500 for the first time. I mean, for me, I consider it short, but it's still a good 150 big blinds. I should just go home, but we're still under our 3-hour minimum session duration, so as long as I can keep my head clear, I can try to stay a little longer to recover some of these detrimental losses.
Please, no! 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 No!
8 minutes later, I lose a few small hands to be down my absolute low point at negative $3,840. 7 minutes after that, I start this next hand with a $1,215 stack. Under the gun opens for 30. The plus one calls. The middle position 3-bets to 140. Damn it, I wish I were deeper. I love suited connectors in position. I'm not holding a pocket pair, so I don't exactly need 10 to 1 here. There are many different types of boards where I can connect heavily with a hand like mine, so I decide to make the cold call in the low jack with 8-9 of diamonds. Under the gun and plus one call as well. So we go 4-handed in position to flop of queen, 5-6, rainbow with 1 diamond. I flop a gut shot straight draw with a backdoor flush draw. This gives us the equivalent of 5 outs. The action gets checked to the original 3-better, who leads with a third pot bet of 200. My stack is not big enough to make this call. I really wish I hadn't faced so many horrendous defeats leading to this point. However, a third pot bet is a really inviting offer. Even though I'm getting bad implied odds against a single opponent for this bet size, with a bet that small, it's possible that if I call here, my other 2 opponents might stick around as well, which will then actually give me pretty decent odds to call. So I decide to make a speculative call, and thankfully both of the other opponents also tag along as well. Alright man, 1-7, let's go! The turn comes, and it's not a 7, but it's the next best thing. It's a 10 of diamonds. We now have a double gut shot with a backdoor flush draw. Aside from a 7, this is the best card I could have hoped for. We've now improved from 4 immediate outs to an amazing 15. This is why having that backdoor flush draw is so vital on the flop. If I just had a naked gut shot, I might have just folded on the flop. The pot is just under 1,400 at this point, but I'm sitting here with just under 900 in my stack. When the action gets checked to the middle position again, he leads for another bet of 700. Mathematically, I have a slightly over 33% to win this hand, with 15 outs versus unknown cards that most likely aren't holding my outs. Even if I had $1,400 and my opponent shoved all in here, I'm still making the call. Thankfully, the bet I'm facing is only 700, so this is a very easy call for me. I just wish I had a ton more money behind to extract even more value from this call in case I were to hit. But since I don't, all I can do is call, leaving myself $175 behind. So, for educational purposes, I'm not going all in. Keep that very important fact in mind. A lot of recreational players and amateurs push all in here. If I'm willing to call up to 1,400 and the bet is for less, I may as well just shove all in with my remaining stack anyways, right? No, not so much. Consider this. I'm getting a discount. Why would I reject it? If the river breaks out, I get to save my last $175 and just go home. $175 may not seem like a lot of money for these stakes and for this pot, but it's still $175. A lot of people don't even make that much after an entire day of work. That's 3 tanks of gas for me, or a lot of toys for my kids. Do you really think my opponent will fold to a $175 bet on the river if I were to hit? For the pot size, he'd likely even call with ace high. So when you're in this type of situation where you're facing a bet that's giving you great pot odds, but leaves you with a little bit of money behind, remember to just call. Save that money and appreciate the discount. I'm hoping one or both of my other opponents will also call or even shove here to give me astronomical odds, but unfortunately they both fold. 2 out of 3 times I'm going to miss this river. Mathematically, I realize that. I'm fully prepared to just take my last $175 and go home. Staying on the table with such a ridiculously short stack is just a waste of time. So the river comes, and it's a beautiful 7 of freaking hearts, giving me the absolute freaking nuts. I raise my arms in triumph and run a few laps around the freaking table. I tear off my shirt and slam it on the freaking ground like a football. Or at least I do all of that in my head. Outwardly, I still want to double up my last $175, man. So I stay perfectly cool until my opponent puts me all in. I make the call and declare that I have the nuts. He shows ace-queen offsuit, and I win my first substantial pot of the night. Only down $1,900 now after 2 hours and 50 minutes into the session. I can see clearly now the rain is gone. 20 minutes later, we're down to only 6-handed. This is the last 5-10 table of the night. I still have quite a long ways before breaking even, but I'm hoping I can earn back some of it when I look down at my least favorite premium hand. Yes, we're talking about pocket kings. Here, under the gun opens to 30. Oh goody, so this won't be a repeat of what happened earlier when I had pocket aces. I 3-bet to 150 in middle position, and then everyone quickly folds. Yeah. For this next hand, we're 5-handed. I'm still stuck, but thankfully my remaining opponents play very similar to 2-5 players. For the first time all night, I feel very comfortable. I finally feel like I can whittle away at my losses if this table continues. I feel like I have a pretty decent sized edge over the remaining players. So here, the button opens to 30. The small blind calls. I call in the big blind with king-jack offsuit. I'm at the top of my range. I probably mix in 3-betting here half the time. But for this hand, I chose the more passive route. The flop comes king, 10-4, rainbow. I'm a huge fan of this flop. Flopping top pair is absolutely monstrous short-handed, especially when I have a pretty good kicker too. So when the small blind checks, I start with a check as well. A lot of button opening hands will continue with their whole range on this type of board. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in this case as the action gets checked around. The turn brings in an 8 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. When the small blind checks, I decide it's time to get in some much needed value. So I put out a bet of 70 into the $100 pot. The button calls, but the small blind folds. The river is a 7 of spades. Jack 9 makes the obvious nuts, and hands like 5-6 and 6-9 make gut shot straights as well. The obvious flush misses though. If I had a hand like Jack 9 here, I would go for max value with an overbet for like 300. But with my particular hand and the way the action has gone, I want to target a light call out of a naked 10, so I put in a small bet of 100. My opponent makes the call, and I show my hand to take down a small pot to keep the momentum going. For the last hand of the night, under the gun limps. I limp in the cutoff with ace-8 offsuit. This is an utter garbage hand, but in position and short-handed, some players actually opt to raise with hands like this. I admit, I also raise with this sort of garbage some of the time in these circumstances as well, which is why I much prefer full ring tables because I don't feel comfortable playing these types of hands and would rather not play them. So here, the button folds, the small blind completes, and the big blind checks, so we go 3-handed to a flop of ace, 7, 5, rainbow. I flop top pair with a backdoor straight draw. I'm a pretty big fan of this flop. When the action checks to me, of course I need to start building the pot, so I lead with a full 100% pot bet of 40. The small blind folds, but the big blind calls. The turn brings in a 6 of hearts. The big blind checks again. I now have an open-ended straight to go along with my top pair. The board is pretty connected though, so if I had a hand like ace-10, I would just check here. But seeing as I have quite a few outs against a hand like 2 pairs, I'm fine with continuing with a bet of 70. Sometimes a weaker hand like the one I'm holding can be more comfortable making another bet as opposed to a stronger hand like ace-10 or ace-jack. You always have to keep the board texture in mind when you think about what kind of hands your opponents might be holding, and if your own hand can withstand a check raise. Because that's exactly what happens when the big blind suddenly puts in a sneaky check raise to 170. Except, I don't think it was all that sneaky. I was prepared for this possibility when I decided to put in my bet on the turn. Unless my opponent is holding 8-9 for the nuts, this is an awful check raise amount. All 2 pair holdings are subject to counterfeit. Even a hand like 3-4 that smashed a gut shot straight needs to raise much bigger here. A raise closer to like 270 would have been better. Both of those types of hands are vulnerable to any hand that contains an 8 here, which, by a stroke of good fortune, I just happen to be holding. I pretend like I have a decision to make, even though you as the viewers and I both know I'm never folding here for this price point. I hoo and haw audibly for a moment, shaking my head noticeably before finally making the call. The river comes, and it's gorgeous. It's a 9 of diamonds. It's the best card I could have asked for. Now even if my opponent turned the nuts with 8-9, we're still chopping. I'm only losing to 8-10. But that sort of hand is only in the realm of possibility, not plausibility. That hand would never make sense in this situation. My opponent gets greedy and leads out for a bet of 220. A less adept player might only call here since they're not holding the nuts. You don't need the nuts every hand to try to extract max value. Sometimes I see a player arrive on the river with the nuts, but not raise to a bet. When asked why, they'll often respond with, "Well, he wasn't going to call anyways." Well, how do you know that if you don't make the raise? You literally don't risk anything. In a tournament setting, you actually get a penalty if you don't raise on the river with the nuts. Here, I do not have the nuts, but I do know that I'm in a chop or win situation. I don't risk anything by raising. If my opponent folds, then who cares? If we chop, who cares? But if he calls and I have the best hand, I could extract a whole ton of value. So I go for a massive haymaker raise to 920. My opponent tanks for over a minute and a half. The longer he takes, the more likely I am to get paid. If I had to guess, I think he had a hand like 3-4. I think he turned a gut shot to the small end of the straight. Even with a hand like that, I personally think you should check this river for pot control. It was a limp pot. You can go for thin value in a raised pot and put me on a big ace like ace-jack or bigger, but in a limp pot, why can't I have an 8 here? Eventually, my opponent does put in the call, and I'm elated to win another sizable pot to nearly crawl out of the hole. Unfortunately, after this hand, the table breaks, but I'm able to leave a happy bear. In for 5,000 and out for 46.14 for a net loss of $386 after 4 hours and 17 minutes of playtime. This was one super hectic session. This was my first attempt at moving up stakes this year. I still suffered a loss, but it was so much better than how badly I was stuck when I was down at my worst. I don't think I played badly. I certainly didn't make any bad calls. I think I just got absolutely annihilated by bad runouts. Overall, I'm pretty glad with my results. I didn't go on tilt or play any hands poorly, despite getting beat down over and over. I may try stepping up to 5-10 again a few more times this month, but overall, it was much more stressful than my usual domination over the 2-5 stakes. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a solid and smash that like button. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to learn more tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em. Hop on over to my Patreon if you're curious about poker coaching or just want to support my work, and let me know in the comments below what you thought of this episode or my vlog in general. I reply to the vast majority of my comments. As always, I hope to see you in the next video.